You may not have known it consciously, but perhaps you felt it in your bones. This was a big week for the spirit. As creatures of the earth, pulled by the moon, living always in the moment between one arrival and the next, the rhythms of this season held us powerfully this week. Perhaps you noticed on Monday night that the big, round harvest moon was peering in through your window. Cheeky thing. Perhaps it kept you awake with a racing mind. There is so much fullness in our lives right now, for good and for ill. Perhaps you felt a moment of perfect balance at 2:20 p.m. on Wednesday afternoon, when the earth was for a moment poised and angled perfectly sideways to the sun, neither pole tipping toward or away from our bright star. Perhaps the autumnal equinox brought you a moment of stillness, a time to pause before our hemisphere began the slow tilt away, bringing shorter days and longer nights. Or perhaps you felt the spirit of gathering in that many Northern Hemisphere traditions celebrate this time of year, the harvest time. Our Jewish friends and neighbors celebrated Sukkot this week, a harvest festival known as the Festival of Booths, which commemorates both the annual harvest for the people of Israel and the time of the exodus from slavery in Egypt, when the ancient people of Israel wandered the desert for 40 years in between first freedom and flourishing in the promised land. During Sukkot, meals and other observances are held in the sukkah, a temporary structure meant to call back to the liminal space of harvest and the fragile in-between dwellings of the Exodus time. All of this, Sukkot and other harvest festivals, the harvest moon and equinox, and thankfully a cold front bringing us some cooler weather, coincided mysteriously with a feeling we may all be experiencing now due to the events of our world, country, and culture, that we are deeply, perhaps uncomfortably, and powerfully in between. We are at a threshold moment in so many ways. The quickening pace of climate change has opened a door between one world and the next, though the door may be closing too fast. A global pandemic has called forth a portal between old, deathly ways of being and the possibility of new, nurturing ones. We wonder who will pass through that portal. And of course, we are just literally in between in this season, between summer and fall, between the height of the pandemic and its end, between some normalcy and continued strangeness in our lives, between how church used to be and how it will eventually be, between how life used to be and how it will eventually be. Perhaps we might each feel precariously balanced, uncertain which way our collective and individual lives will tip, towards greater care, compassion, concern for earth and thriving, or toward deeper suffering, further isolation, or more systemic brutality. Perhaps we have felt this precarity building for years. Certainly our experience of global pandemic has deepened this sense of being at the edge. Or perhaps your intimate world has already tipped one way or the other for at least a time. In the world of theology, this time of betwixt and between has a name: liminality. Great tomes have been written on the power of liminal time and liminal space, and the tools of the world's religions to help humans navigate it. The word liminality came to us from the anthropologist Arnold van Gennep, who coined the phrase to describe the portion of a rite of passage when a participant has left behind one status in the community, but has not yet arrived at the new status or been reintegrated into the community. These rites of passage, he says, give form to our experience of in-between times and help humans grapple with the unavoidable experience of transition in our lives as creatures in an always changing world. The experience of liminality, or transition or in-between, is usually a period of disorientation and ambiguity, of being outside or betwixt and between, of not even being sure quite what questions to ask, much less their answers. Liminality brings about great uncertainty, but also great potential for transformation. In liminal time and space, anything is possible. Everything is fluid, neither one thing nor the other, but both and everything. Well, I probably don't need to tell you any more about the qualities of liminal space because we are living it. We have been living it. But what I do want to do is normalize something for you. The brain hates liminal space. From the time we are born, our brains, our bodyguards, struggle with transitions in differing measure with our different personality and neural networks. Ask any toddler to move from one activity to the next without fair warning and lots of care, and you are likely to get the dramatic results that most of us never really entirely leave behind: the transition tantrum, throwing oneself on the floor, unable to deal with being in between. The brain hates transitional space. As the guardian of our bodies, always working to protect us, always keeping an eye out for danger, and therefore most assured when things are either one way or the other, when they're clear. When we feel arrived, the brain consents for us to relax. When it can draft a model for what to expect, the brain is most pleased. But when we are in between and confused, the brain is very unhappy with us. Wants to rush us through to where things are clear and established. The spirit, however, is drawn to the in-between, to the places of possibility where things are not yet and maybe and could be. The spirit loves the neither here nor there as the place where transformation occurs. Irish spirituality calls the in-between spaces of this world thin places, where the boundaries between worlds thin out and matters of the spirit are close at hand. There is incredible potential in between. Everything could shift in ways that matter deeply. Between this discomfort of the brain and this longing of the spirit, the body, I think, simply wishes to be where it is. Hopes the brain and spirit will stop fighting, is exhausted by the back and forth. And that observation about the need of the body causes me to wonder, what if the problem is not so much the in-between being difficult, but the way that the brain and body and spirit get out of sync with one another in the fear of transition, trying to skip from one place to the next? Maybe liminal space would feel better if we paid closer attention to the transition instead of rushing through. Maybe it is our presence to the in-between that helps us bear it. The wisdom of religious traditions seems to support this wondering, as many share practices of stillness in transitional space to let the brain, body, and spirit catch up with one another in reunion. The Christian monastic tradition practices statio, or pause, as an invitation to find what they call the moments between the moments. Some Buddhist traditions invite practitioners to bow before entering a space, therefore literally crossing a threshold with total presence. The pagan traditions turn on the wheel of the year and invite practitioners into deep ritual space at each seasonal transition. And Jewish practitioners sometimes touch a mezuzah when entering and leaving their homes, as well as praying designated prayers to bring their attention to many common daily actions. And isn't this just the wisdom that is easy to hear and sometimes very hard to practice? That if we can stay in the moment at hand, rather than fleeing to the past or skipping to the future, we can deepen into a boundless richness of possibility and experience. I've been thinking then that some practical steps for inviting our brains and bodies to stay in the in-between long enough for transformation. Steps informed by traditional wisdom and brain science, but more practical than mystical. The liminal space is mystical enough on its own. And so when I come to encounter it, I find I want something of a spiritual checklist. So here are my suggestions for us. To anchor ourselves in the body, which is always just exactly where it is. Notice sensory input, grounding down into your experience of the moment at hand. This can give the brain safety cues that allow us to open into the spaciousness of the transitional moment. Another suggestion is to give our brains small rituals and expectations that we know can be met in order to give the brain a more comfortable and safe place from which to encounter bigger unknowns. During the deepest liminal space of the pandemic, small rituals around cooking and eating kept me sane. Another thought is to give ourselves a literal safe spot to explore the in-between. A cozy space to cast off into the depths that are neither here nor there. I have a purple velvet chair with a very fuzzy blue blanket where I meditate in the mornings, and I've noticed that I find myself drifting there anytime I feel uncomfortably betwixt and between. Another way we can go through liminality is to opt into the rhythms and pace of the natural world around us, rather than pushing against them so hard. Every sunrise and every sunset invites you into transitional space. Every changing weather pattern, every season's turning invites you into an experience of liminality and possibility if you are willing to follow the Earth's cues. And lastly, perhaps we can spend more intentional time in between with these guardrails in place. Perhaps you might pause at the literal threshold between one room and another. Take a breath there. Perhaps pausing at the metaphorical thresholds between one big moment and another. Take 3 deep breaths whenever you notice that you are in between. Observe what is emerging, what possibilities are open, what growth is being invited. Dear ones, we are in a time between, and we will be, between old deathly ways and new ones, between one world and the next, and always, always between each precious moment of this life. Let us pause together at the threshold of all that may become. Breathe, arriving together here and now. Grab each other's hands. and step boldly through into all that may come. May it be so.